Okay, well, as the title of this video suggests, this is my 2000 subscriber special. 3 or 4 years ago I posted a video on YouTube to promote a book I'd written. I wasn't really expecting any subscribers at all, so I was quite surprised when someone subscribed to the channel, and it encouraged me to post another video, not very good, about repairing a pet computer. And it grew from there, and I started posting videos on a more regular basis, and here I am a few years later with 2,000 subscribers. So thanks to everyone that's subscribed to my channel. It's really appreciated. The support you've offered is also really appreciated. I've had a lot of positive comments and feedback, so as I say, it's much appreciated. It's very gratifying. There's a lot of hard work that goes into making these videos, as I'm sure any YouTuber will tell you, and they may not be particularly good videos, but I'm really just trying to get across information as best I can. So I don't write scripts, as you can probably tell. I just turn on the camera and start waffling, so hopefully you find something useful in the information I'm trying to provide. So I've been trying to think of what to put into this video, and decided to do something slightly different, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. But just a bit of brief history before I go into the main point of this video. So I got into electronics very early on, probably from the age of 5, and started blowing things up and taking things apart and getting into a lot of trouble with my parents because I didn't reassemble a lot of the things I took apart. And then I got good enough to start to reassemble them. And I started building things, robots, simple computer systems, and then ultimately I started building equipment. So I built this I think when I was 12, and I used to document everything I did, and I do strongly advise anyone that wants to get into electronics to do that. So everything I built I would properly document and draw schematics. I didn't have a CAD program, so it was all drawn with pen and paper. But I'd have a manual like this for all the different pieces of equipment that I would develop, and didn't have much money at the time, so most components were salvaged, even paper I tended to recycle. So it was just really using whatever components or equipment I could get my hands on, sort of dumpster diving, finding things that had been thrown away, and then designing my own equipment. So I used to design my own scopes, multimeters, and this particular piece of equipment is a digital storage spectrum analyzer and pulse analyzer. So it's really 2 instruments in one. It captures pulses for analytical purposes, puts them on the display. It doesn't actually work anymore, so I might get round to repairing it at some point. And it's also a multi-channel system for analysing spectrum, audio spectrum. And I think it took me about 6 months to build this. Again, like I said, didn't have a CAD system. All the PCBs were laid out by hand. It's quite a complex piece of equipment in terms of the electronics that's in here. There's quite a few boards. I'll have a quick look inside in a minute. But this got me into digital electronics, and I went on from there to start designing computer control systems for robots. So as I said, it's quite complex. I won't go through the rest of the schematics, but I'll just pop the cover off this so you can have a look inside and see the sorts of things that I was working on at the time. Okay, I haven't actually had this open now for probably 20 years, so I'm not quite sure if we have any critters in here or not. No, it doesn't actually look too bad. So as you can see, there's quite a lot in here, and now the reason I built this was because I got hold of this IC. This is just a 6116 memory IC, which these days you can get almost for free. But at the time it was very expensive. They were quite hard to get hold of, and because I had this, I decided I had to do something with it, and so I built this piece of equipment around it. It's kind of complex machine. It's got lots of analog circuits, digital control circuits, scanning system for the CRT. This came out of a small black and white TV, but the circuitry for the black and white TV at the time they were very bulky, so I redesigned the scanning and EHT circuit for it, and crammed it all into a fairly small off-the-shelf enclosure. And this is the sort of thing that I used to do in my spare time, and ultimately it got me into building computer systems. And that's kind of what the point of this video is, that one of the things I became interested in was artificial intelligence. And as a systems developer, I've built and designed quite a few systems that incorporate neural nets and fuzzy logic systems, both in software and in firmware. And I was interested from very early on in the idea of artificial intelligence, and I used to build robots and try and get them to do things under control of a homemade computer system. And then I started buying things like ZX80s and 81s and repurposing them to do that. But early on I built everything from transistors and made 4-bit and 6-bit processors. And one thing I learned very early on when trying to design systems with artificial intelligence is that they're incomplete, and they'll always be incomplete. What I mean by that is, if I built a robot to go and pick up an egg, then it couldn't make an omelette. And it couldn't learn how to make an omelette. And unlike humans, which have a huge degree of adaptability, and so if we come across something we haven't seen before, we can very quickly adapt to it. Machines can't do that. They tend to fall flat on their face or do something very bad when they're confronted with something they haven't been designed to do. Even neural net systems and learning systems, if it's something outside the scope that they have been designed to do, then things go bad, and they can go bad very quickly. Now, what I'm really leading towards here is that there's been a drive, no pun intended, over the last few years towards automated self-driving cars. And it does alarm me quite a bit. I've driven around 2 million miles in my profession over the last 35 years, and come across many different things on the roads. And it does really alarm me that there's this idea that automated vehicles can soon be roaming the roads. It's not so much the technology itself that concerns me, it's the programming of the system. Any scenario that the vehicle comes across on the road, it's going to have to deal with. And the way in which it deals with it will be very dependent on the people that have programmed it. And in this age of identity politics, everyone's got an axe to grind, it means that the control over your destiny when you're in a vehicle is no longer your own. And what the vehicle will do in terms of trying to preserve your life or otherwise is decided by somebody else depending on their personal beliefs rather than your desire to stay alive. Now, to try and put this into perspective, what I'm going to do is we'll look at a website. It's not my website, I'm using it under the fair use terms of YouTube, and it's a website that allows individuals to give their opinion on certain scenarios that could come up in a self-driving system. So we'll get onto the website and have a look, and I'll go through and explain my thoughts on the scenarios, and ideally I'd like some feedback from yourselves as to what you feel would be the appropriate response from the vehicle. So I'll get over to the website, we'll have a look and go from there. Okay, this is the sort of website I was talking about. It sets up scenarios based around autonomous self-driving vehicles and gives you a couple of options as to what the vehicle should do under certain conditions. Now, I've developed a certain healthy skepticism over the years, and in particular over the last year I've really lost a lot of confidence in allowing other people to dictate my destiny. And this is a good example of the sort of thing I'm talking about, and I'll explain what I mean by this as we go through these. There aren't too many, I think there's 13 on this particular site, but they are very leading manipulative questions, and you do need to question the questions and the context in which they are being presented, rather than blindly just say A or B as being a scenario. So I'll go through these and explain what I mean. So if we show the descriptions, so in this case the car's deemed to have sudden brake failure, and if the car just continues and crashes into an obstacle, then the driver of the vehicle will die. And in the second option, the vehicle swerves and mows down an innocent bystander, or a supposed innocent bystander. I'll come back to what I mean by that in a minute or two. So in this instance, you have to decide, should you be the one that dies, or should your use of the vehicle endanger other people? And they're the two options that you're given. In my mind, I think this is ridiculous. I think there are other options, and what I'll do, I'll wait until we've gone through a few slides before I say why I think this is so bad. But in this instance, I'm going to click on this option so we can move on. In this one, similar sort of idea. The car's coming down here, we have brake failure, and for some reason it's trying to make a determination on who lives or dies based on who the people are, which again I think is ridiculous. Again, does the vehicle continue and mow down this group, or does it swerve and mow down this group? So in this case I'm going to click on this one. So in this case, again, brake failure, and the vehicle for some bizarre reason is being driven by some cats and dogs, and in this instance the cats and dogs will swerve to mow down an athlete, a doctor and a young boy. Again, not quite sure why who you're mowing down is supposed to be relevant. And we'll click on this. Didn't like the boy anyway. So in this instance we have again the same sort of thing. The car brakes fail, and continuing ahead will mow down an elderly gentleman who's crossing the road, or the car can swerve and kill the occupant of the vehicle. So in this case we'll select this one. So in this instance we have again brake failure, and the vehicle is going to swerve and kill the occupants of the car, or it can mow down this criminal. Quite how the car has determined this person's a criminal is a bit beyond me, but rather than keep going through these, because they all have the same issue as far as I'm concerned, and they are irrelevant questions. I think they are very poor questions and show a complete lack of understanding as to what constitutes safety in autonomous vehicles. It's not so much the vehicle itself, but it's the way that the people using the road when they're pedestrians are deemed to be blameless, and that they're using the road in the same way the car driver is using the road, but they're not being held accountable for their actions. Now, as I say, I've done an awful lot of driving, and I can guarantee that as a pedestrian you have far more scope for avoiding cars than car drivers do for avoiding pedestrians. I'm very lucky. I've driven nearly 2 million miles and never had an accident, but you know, that could change at any time. And one thing that really does bug me these days is the way that pedestrians seem to think they can just step out into a road and leave it up to the car driver to avoid them. And it is getting worse. A few years ago I was at a pedestrian crossing as a pedestrian, and the pedestrian crossing lights were stopping pedestrians walking across the road. And it was a dual carriageway, a very busy dual carriageway. And while we were waiting, two teenagers, probably 17, 18, walked up. One just walked straight out into the road without even looking. And as he stepped out, his mate shouted to him that the lights were on red, and he turned around and said, "It's okay, they're not allowed to run you down." which really for me underlines where road safety is going wrong. With, the pedestrians are being brainwashed into thinking that car drivers mow them down intentionally, which is ridiculous. So in my way of thinking, the correct answer in this one is this option. Anyone that uses a road, whether they are a pedestrian or a car driver, should accept responsibility for their presence on the road and not just make the assumption that the car driver is the one that has to look out for pedestrians. The pedestrians are in a far better position to do that themselves, but holding pedestrians blameless and always putting the onus onto the occupants of the vehicle is ridiculous. So in my way of thinking, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, this is just the way I see this, I would mow down whoever's on the pedestrian crossing because they should have been looking where they were going. And the same thing here is this character should be aware there's a vehicle coming, and it's very obvious if there's a vehicle approaching you at 60 miles an hour and he's 40 feet away. If you step out in front of the vehicle, you're going to get mown down. And so as a pedestrian who's about to step out into a road, you should accept responsibility for your own safety, not expect somebody else to do it for you. Doesn't matter whether you're on a crossing or not, accidents happen and you should accept responsibility for your own actions. So I won't go through the rest of them, but this is my concern with autonomous systems, that while the technology is developing very quickly, if you do get involved in developing autonomous systems, they're only as good as whatever decisions are programmed into them, and they will always be incomplete. There will always be scenarios that the designers hadn't thought of, and as I say, it does concern me that for example, you could get somebody who just maliciously steps out in front of a car, knowing how the cars behave, to either intentionally kill the occupants of the car or somebody else that happens to be walking nearby. And this is always a concern that's not addressed with this sort of questioning. It really needs to be thought out a lot better, and the presence of mind and the responsibility of pedestrians should be included in these scenarios, and at the moment they're not. So okay, that's it for this video. It's as I said, I'm sure that people will disagree, and that's kind of the point, and that you know, what is the best approach to this? Should we take a general consensus and everyone else has to put up with that whether they agree? The argument I've heard that, well, there will be autonomous cars, therefore it has to be one of the options, I think is also misleading. We don't need autonomous cars. It's just something that these days seems to be the part of the course, that somebody's thought of something, therefore it has to be done. So any feedback on this would be very interesting. What are your thoughts? Do you think that car drivers should always be held responsible for their vehicle? I'm not suggesting that car drivers should be able to drive down the pavement and mow people down whenever they feel like it. I'm talking about use of vehicles on a public highway. Or should pedestrians be held accountable for their behaviour on public highways? As I say, any feedback would be very interesting. And thanks once again for everyone that subscribed to my channel. It's very much appreciated.